Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, wherever you are. In the Irish language for hello, welcome is not just fáilte, which is welcome, but we actually say Céad Míle fáilte, which is 100,000 welcomes. So from Dublin City University, I'd like to send 100,000 welcomes to all our participants gathered around the room and people who will watch us later on. This is truly an international event, and it's a huge honor for me to welcome people to it. Today in the United States, they celebrate Thanksgiving. I'd like to wish all our kind of American friends and extended family a happy Thanksgiving. But for the rest of us, it's an opportunity to reflect on the things that matter to us. And it is an appropriate day then, Thanksgiving, for us to engage in this conversation on UN75 hosted by the Dublin Law and Politics Review. I'd like to commend the Law and Politics Review for organising this event. They're one of my favourite groups here in the city, and I admire them especially because they always tackle the big issues. They never shy away in terms of their ambition, in terms of their inquiry, and in terms of their determination to make an impact. Already they have dealt with issues like fake news, secondary victimization, climate change, big issues that affect all of us. I particularly enjoy my engagements with them because of the diversity, I think, of thought, first of all, but also the interdisciplinary nature of the conversations. I'm pleased because our university, Dublin City University, shares these perspectives. And we admire the way that the Dublin Law and Politics Review leads and sets examples to us, I suppose, as institutions on how we might grapple with big questions. So congratulations to the organisers for that. Today is part of a global event. We can see it in terms of the people present in the room here, but it's also part of, obviously, the United Nations 75 Dialogue. That, as you know, that the UN launched this dialogue in January to mark the 75th anniversary of our community of nations. And we began this, or the UN began it on our behalf, as an opportunity to really understand the hopes and expectations of the citizens of the world, our common home, relating to the big issues and international cooperation in the future. COVID happened, none of us could have predicted it this time last year, but I think that the pandemic, and the global pandemic as we call it, reminds us really of the importance of international cooperation. And we've already seen examples in the year of the disastrous consequences when we fail to see ourselves as a global community and politicize challenges that face our planet. I'm delighted that DCU, as I say, is able to take part in this global dialogue. Thanks, as I said at the outset, to the Dublin Law and Politics Review. It's especially important that today's focus is on inequality and financial crisis, because what the pandemic has shown us clearly, even at a university level, but in the city, nationally and beyond, is that the crisis has impacted on the disadvantaged disproportionately. And that is true. As I say, we see it amongst our students, we can see it nationally. So it's important for us to recall the critical imperative of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and nurturing that sense of community and a sense of responsibility across the planet. And we have tried as a university to align our strategy and our priorities with those development goals. And we're pleased that we pride ourselves as a university that puts people first, and not people first in a selfish way, but people first in a global way. We're delighted that this discussion today will facilitate all of us, not just in identifying problems. Anyone can identify problems, but creatively in bringing these great minds together to discuss solutions. And above all, what an event like today reinforces for us is the importance of empathy, that the 21st century attribute, the ability to put ourselves in other people's shoes and to develop solutions to the problems which tackle us all. As I say, that the organisers have put together a wonderful panel. Georgopolous, who'll speak first of all about the economics, then Rahman, who'll follow through, and then Aranguiz, who'll speak afterwards. I greatly appreciate the presence of speakers, but everybody in this virtual room who will contribute to the debate, that this is a seminar in the very best sense of the word, bringing the world together. And we have a huge debt of gratitude to the organisers. I'm always in admiration for my colleague Annelieke, who's the DLPR chairperson. So congratulations for bringing it together. I'd like to thank Valentina, who's the event officer. Congratulations, Valentina. And I'd like to thank Michael Breen of the School of Law and Government here in DCU. So, Gurv Mila Mahagav, I look forward to kind of listening in and listening back on the recording. So thank you very much, Annelieke.
Thank you. You're very welcome. And without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to our channel chair for today, which is Professor Derek O'Brien from Dublin City University.
That's great. Thanks, Annelieke. I'm conscious of time constraints and everybody, and we have 4 excellent speakers. So what I propose to do is just briefly outline sort of the rules. I guess each speaker will have approximately 15 minutes. We may stray over a couple of minutes after. And if they do, we may send a sort of a chat reminder of time. So we're going to have 4 speakers, and then we're going to try and open into a plenary discussion session. So I just remind people that the event is being recorded, and that if you can keep your questions until the plenary session once the 4 speakers have concluded, if that's okay. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Georgopolous, the Associate Prof of Economics at York University in Canada, who will introduce us to the economic policy during the crisis. Dr. Georgopolous.
Thank you. Could everybody hear me and see my slides? Yes. Thank you, Annelieke, for inviting me, and thank you, Derek, and the Dublin Law and Politics Review. It's a pleasure to be here. I thought I would first just go over an outline of my talk. I will give an overview of the causes of financial crises in general, look at then the income and wealth effects caused by a crisis, and then touch upon the distributional effects where the inequalities will show up. Again, that's the theoretical part. And the 4th part will be the empirical evidence of financial crises and inequality. And finally, touch upon some reforms and remedies. Since some of the previous crises, and actually what is going on right now with respect to COVID, not a financial crisis, but a crisis nevertheless, that some policies that have been put in place can ideally be implemented when there is a financial crisis. So causes of the financial crisis, simply put, the main factor is this mismanagement of the financial sector with respect to regulation. Essentially, we have a credit expansion in light of weak financial markets, weak with respect to low transparency, monitoring and enforcement. And that produces what we call asymmetric information, uneven information between borrowers and lenders, more information on behalf of the borrowers on their true risk, which then leads to moral hazard and adverse selection issues, huge topics in economics, and I'm sure they are discussed at length in any contract law to reduce these problems. And typically we have an originate and distribute type of business model, or essentially means transactions are made on behalf of commission as opposed to any one party absorbing long-term risk. So you have wrong information entering financial markets, essentially due to the mispricing of risk. These principles can explain the 1997 East Asian financial crisis, where weak financial markets, you had a massive inflow of capital, mainly from Western countries, bad lending standards, non-performing loans and capital flight, US financial crisis, many factors.
Sir, you've muted yourself.
Really? Sorry. Okay, let's try this again. Can you hear me now? Sorry. How about I just start on this first slide? I think you saw the outline. The biggest problem was creating a financial crisis is mismanagement of financial sector with respect to regulation, which leads to massive credit. Typically what happens is it's a credit expansion in light of weak financial markets, low transparency, monitoring and enforcement, and we have what we call in economics asymmetric information between borrowers and lenders, which creates moral hazard and adverse selection, big topics in the field of economics, and I'm sure in contract law. Originate, distribute type of business models, which essentially means transactions are based on commission as opposed to any one party absorbing long-term risk. So essentially there's wrong pricing of risk, which then leads to a crisis. And these factors explain the most recent major financial crisis in East Asia in '97, the 2008 financial crisis with heavy deregulation, financial innovation, and massive capital inflows, lending to subprime borrowers, mispricing risk of these borrowers. The Euro crisis, where you had a creation of a Euro too big to fail phenomenon, which led to excessive lending to Southern European countries who had weak financial institutions. So that is the essence of a financial crisis, the factors. And let's look at the income and wealth effects, theoretically. Generally, a financial crisis will lead to a worsening of balance sheets of typically of major financial institutions, reducing net wealth, which creates uncertainty in the quality of borrowers out there, including other banks. So you have a severe contraction of lending by banks, contraction in the money market, reduced liquidity in the financial system as there's deleveraging. And so now it's starting to spill over to Main Street, as we say, from Wall Street to Main Street, less lending happening throughout, meaning less investment, less in hiring, and reduction in real wages and employment, reduced consumption, reduced real GDP. So it's spilled over to the real economy. So income is reduced, consumption is reduced. You also have an asset price effect, a wealth effect. Asset prices decline, a negative wealth effect, which leads to a drop in consumption and a drop in GDP. So those are the elements of just a broad effect on income and wealth. The distributional effects, here's where we're starting to see inequality. Crises typically hit the vulnerable, particularly the young, as opposed to the seniority of protected older workers. You have a reduction in employment in the formal sector and informal sector, and people move from the formal to the informal, putting downward prices, wages on the informal labor market. Construction seems relatively stable, especially if you have a fiscal response of infrastructure spending. That we do have a wealth effect, typically older, wealthier people. They're exposed more to the stock market and their pensions have declined. On the whole, though, the overall effect is that there will be a drop in income, there'll be increase in income inequality, despite the drop in the high income group wealth. Homeowners, middle income wage earners, well, reduced asset price of their home value, so their mortgage debt in real terms has gone up. Higher interest rates, meaning higher interest payments. More distributional effects. Small and medium-sized firms are hit harder. Essentially, they have less access to credit relative to larger firms. this is all in light of credit rationing, lending has contracted. You have the weakening bargaining power of unorganized labor in small firms. Just to give you a simple example, here in Canada, we're going through a crisis with COVID, but we have one of the top retailers in Canada simply not paying rent to the landlord for the past 7 months, just not paying any rent. And this is the bargaining power of these large firms, probably will go to litigation. They have the wealth to go to court. Simply, this cannot be done by a small firm, simply cannot refuse to pay rent for the first 6 or 7 months. You have, in some cases, you have governments that retrench fiscally, which leads to cuts in public outlays and social program payments, and that hits more the less well-off people. This was certainly true in the Euro crisis, where you had some countries forced to do austerity, which really led to a decrease in government spending and programs and increase in taxes. You have banks attempting to increase revenues by increasing fees. This is simply a regressive fee structure for lower income groups. You have typically, if you have your own currency, you have a depreciation of your currency, which means import prices are higher. And this could hit people hard if you have individuals or a country that is a net importer of food. So let's look at the empirical evidence, the data on this. 2008 financial crisis, the recovery largely top down and finance driven. And this was mainly supposedly to that we have a too big to fail problem. We have a lot of systemic risk. You let one bank go under, it'll bring down the whole system. So you have to theoretically bail out these large banks. There was a flood of liquidity into the system, supposedly to start lending out to smaller businesses. It did not happen. You had the large banks hoarding reserves, and then you had really the financial sector quickly recovering slowly. Soon after 2008 or 9, a quick recovery in the financial system and the profits and the compensation of employees, whereas other sectors, a gradual decline over 10 years. We had, and we have Perry substantiating that income inequality increased during the Great Recession. Top income earners declined by 4%, median by income by 9%, and 20% decline to lower income people. Another study, average income for all groups except the top 1% declined, and the top 1% of US income earners has risen. Now, Ireland, if you look at a good study first by Jenkins, but from Callan, a slight decline in income inequality actually, but you have to look at disposable income, and that is due to the strong social transfers given during the crisis in Ireland. So we need to distinguish between market income, your gross income, and disposable income, and they could vary in the response of a crisis. So we have the study by Perry showing, so this is the top inequality at the top income group, rising, the green is market income rising, but declining gradually when you look at disposable income. And same with low income groups, rise in market inequality income, but a gradual rise in disposable income. So some of these countries provide good social assistance. And by the way, this is the United States, actually, when you take into account. So we're talking about just after the crisis here that I'm talking about here, the 2008 crisis. So developing countries, another study by Habib et al. For 3 countries, middle income people are hit. Income inequality of middle income increases, and that's due to a lot in working in the manufacturing sector, and the manufacturing sector typically gets hurt. Also, urban households get hurt more than than rural households. You saw this urban-rural divide also happening in countries of Greece, Italy, and Portugal during the Euro crisis. Now, there's been some discussion of late that actually inequality can lead to a financial crisis. So the causation is the other way around. And it really started with a paper by Rahman and a few others. And the argument is, well, it first became, it was highlighted in the United States, where some argued that the involvement of the US government with government-sponsored enterprises like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac really pushed to make households for Americans very viable. So there was a lot of sponsoring of these mortgage-backed institutions and very competitive, competing very hard to lend money to low-income subprime households. So inequality led to the crisis. Also in developing emerging countries, at times you have the government taking on a lot of debt, creating deficits for social spending, which could lead to a sovereign debt crisis. So the argument is income inequality leads to financial crisis, which leads to a greater income inequality phenomenon. It's received some traction, and you could see a study by Barajas that does over many countries, where a simulation study shows that decreasing income inequality leads to and time T is a financial crisis, which exacerbates the inequality and slowly increases. So there's some evidence of this direction of causation. Finally, just touch upon some reforms and remedies. We probably know a lot of the reforms, what happened in the United States. An important one, the Consumer Protection Agency that laid out rules for firms lending out and making it more legible for borrowers. An important one, just identifying systemically important financial institutions and doing stress tests. So this is all to reduce too big to fail problem. Volcker rule, reduce high-risk derivative securities trading. The big one, Basel III, higher capital ratios, which essentially involves bail-ins instead of bailouts. So shareholders take more of the loss. Counter-cyclical leveraging. So when the economy is booming, you actually reduce the growth of lending to avoid excessive lending during a boom time. Fiscal and banking reforms of the EU. I do believe we have another discussant on the EU. And the European Central Bank acting as a last resort, reducing household borrowing with respect to, or reducing the risk, having certain loan to value ratios. Canada increased the loan to value ratio to 65%. So expansion of transfer payments during the crisis, not unlike some of the fiscal measures being taken now in many countries, including in Canada, where there's support given to businesses whose revenues have declined, self-employed people who really didn't have any assistance. So these have helped substantially, rent subsidies. So these can be implemented in any crisis, including a financial crisis, during times of a crisis to prevent income inequality. And we see the central bank and the government taking on a greater role to provide liquidity to small businesses and self-employed. So in Canada, we have the Canada mortgage bonds, which essentially the Bank of Canada is buying to provide much more liquidity in the financial system to prevent this contraction of lending. And it has essentially worked, but there still needs to be a little bit more given directly to small businesses through these types of programs. But I think we're learning a lot through COVID on the social policies that can be put into place under any crisis that can prevent income inequality. Thank you very much.
That was excellent. Thank you, Dr. Georgopolous. Can I ask that we get, I suppose, the technical issues to get sorted out now about screen share and getting the next presentation lined up. And I'll take the time to introduce our next contributor, Professor Dr. Atiur Rahman, the 10th Governor of the Central Bank of Bangladesh, who will discuss the response of central banks to the financial crisis. So hopefully our technical issues are sorted out. Excellent. Over to you, Professor Rahman.
Thank you, Chair, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening and good morning to you all. We just heard a very good presentation from Dr. Georgopolous. I don't know if I have spelled it rightly. I'll call Dr. George. He has given a very good overview of the financial crisis and the other crises that we have already faced, and now we are in a bigger crisis, really originating from COVID-19. And in his last words, he was talking about the role of the central bank, which probably he has touched the right chord when he said that the central banks all around the world have really come out with a very innovative liquidity support to not only the small business, but the business as a whole, I would say. In Bangladesh particularly, the central bank has been playing in a very, I would say, pivotal role in terms of taking the economy forward and stabilizing the economy that really has come up from the COVID. And I'm sure all of you are aware that we are passing through a very period of radical uncertainty. We really don't know the implications of this huge crisis, the COVID crisis, which we never faced. It's very difficult to say how the world will unfold in the near future or in some years. Probably this will take few years or many years. And this is a period when unfortunately the period preceded of this COVID, we had a lot of attack on the globalization. The global connections were ruptured, and a lot of uncertainty in the business of the international cooperation that you were talking about. So I'll not be surprised if in a situation like this, if the countries go for more inward looking in terms of food security, in terms of improving supply chains, in terms of taking advantage of the digital transformation and go for e-governance and e-learning and remote working, go for green recovery or better investment in people, particularly education, health, and social protection. So these are the kind of responses that I am foreseeing in the coming days. But thanks to the US election, I'm getting a bit more hopeful about more economic cooperation in the pipeline with the change in guards. So I thought, let's go back to how did we face the global crisis, global financial crisis. Slide, please. Next, about the 2007-8 global financial crisis. Immediately after that crisis, the whole world came forward to really find solutions, and the central banks particularly came up, but the UN system also came forward. I was party to an inquiry report on the sustainable finance, which came out in 2015 by the UNEP. And there we came out with 3 solutions that, we need a inclusive and sustainable finance for really facing any kind of crisis that George has already elaborated on. And this has to be effective, particularly the effectiveness of the market in embedding new drivers of value creation and risk to meet the needs of the intended beneficiaries of the financial services. The financial services have always been working only for the finance, not for the real economy. So I thought we better to reorient our attention to the real economy. We have to be efficient, because efficiency of the system in terms of underlying cost in delivering the service, and their digitization probably is the answer at the moment. And of course, our focus on resilience of the system to shocks flowing from the unsustainable development and potential volatilities of the transition process. So these are the areas we really pushed. I thought but this is also true even the post-COVID crisis, the financial crisis that is accompanying it. Next, please. We have to really remember the true purpose of the finance, actually. And I'm giving 3 quotes. This will tell you that where to focus on. In fact, Christine Lagarde in 2019 said in one of her speech, reshape finance into something that is more aligned with societal values and more connected to interest of all stakeholders, from customers to workers to stakeholders to local communities and future generations. So she was both looking at present and the future. And Paul Collier, in one of his books, as you can see, has said a society should be moral according to whether its laws were designed for the benefits of the most disadvantaged. So this was something I thought
Dr. Rahman, I'm afraid you've gone on mute.
I'm sorry, this happens sometimes, again, another quote from Sela of the World Bank. She said, you have good finance, bad finance, and ugly finance. You need to make sure it serves citizens, the SMEs, and not just the bankers or the wealthy or the chosen few. I think this tells you that where should we really focus our attention. Given this background, then let me focus on the Bangladesh campaign for financial inclusion. I was fortunately from 2009 to 16, I was leading this campaign, and there we have tried to give a new look to the central bank. We thought we should make central bank more developmental, particularly in the developing context, not for the developed country. I'm talking about the developing country like ours, and there the goal should be maintain a healthy growth rate to keep low income, climate change threatened Bangladesh for inclusive prosperity. So that is the goal. And strategy was bolstering domestic demand and enable increased consumption. And we are putting a lot of support for agriculture, SMEs, cottage industries, so that people really have money. And even today, that lesson is being followed in Bangladesh, and Bangladesh is doing far better than many other countries. Action was the inclusive financing with particular attention to the bottom of the pyramid, as I said, agriculture, SME, green finance. So we created a lot of innovative financing strategies. While reaching the bottom of the social pyramid, we really depended a lot on the ICT and digitization that was unfolding, and where we really wanted to give more money for creating employment and non-farm activities in MSME sectors. Women power empowerment was prioritized. Women entrepreneurs were given special credit lines. And the rural economy was prioritized, and green finance and other innovations in Bangladesh. And Bangladesh Bank, the central bank, played the leading role in making that. And now the government is also coming forward. And there were rewarding outcomes of these interventions that we made, actually. Bangladesh really coped pretty well with the global financial crisis. And we got about, next please, we got about 8% growth rate over the last 10 years or so, and particularly last 4-5 years. Although this year we had a problem, and even then the government experienced about 5+ growth, although World Bank says much less, but we'll come back to that. Financial inclusion, enhanced agriculture, SMEs, women, and green initiatives. and 7% increase in commercial branches, 68% in ATMs, and 33,000% increase in mobile money accounts. And this really impacted on the ground, and the rural poverty came down by half, and even urban poverty was stable, at least, not going up. And Bangladesh as a whole experienced a poverty reduction by almost half, from 40% to 20%, and extreme poverty to 11%. But unfortunately, this COVID has really washed away some of those gains, and the poverty is increasing now. Informal sector has been badly affected by COVID. And so given that the pandemic-induced slowdown has affected even Bangladesh, World Bank says this year Bangladesh will have 1.6% growth. Asian Development Bank says it will have a 6.8% growth, and IMF says it about 4% growth, and Bangladesh says it will have far better than this growth. So but there is no doubt the informal sector has been badly hurt. Poverty has increased, inequality has intensified. So we got to really focus on that. And in that circumstances, Bangladesh government has come out with a very, very prudent stimulus package. As you heard our Prime Minister in the UN, that she said about 4.03% of the GDP has been given as a stimulus package. This has increased further. It's now 4.3%, and the implementation is going on. Export-oriented large manufacturing industries are getting the money, although SME, the housing and the agriculture small, there is a money in place, but the implementation is a bit slow. But the money is coming up, and the central bank is taking initiative to implement it further. Next, please. It's a huge kind of injection of money by changing CRR, repo rates, and restrictions on bank dividend, and change in advanced deposit ratio. So about $7 billion have been injected just on easing the regulations at this stage. And I thought this was a smart move, although we need to wrap up at some point in time. But at the moment, I thought it was a good move. So the digitization that we followed has really paid us off very well. Our mobile financial service, as you know, the world famous bKash and others are really doing pretty well. And during this COVID crisis, we see that mobile financial service transactions increased by 68% in July year-to-year, and number of MFS accounts almost doubled to 43 million between February and July alone. And this is growing every day. Agent banking and other innovations that we have done, the deposit and advance are growing in a big way. So still there are challenges ahead, and one of the challenges, of course, as I said, the smaller borrowers finding it difficult to avail the loans which have been created by the government through the stimulus package. And next, please. And there, I think not about 25% of the stimulus have been disbursed until September, where 80% of the stimulus have been disbursed for the large borrowers. So here lies, the indication of the inequalities that is increasing, even on a very good program like this. And special attention, therefore, is required to monitor implementation of the stimulus packages, particularly at the lower end of the pyramid. And the central bank is already coming forward with a digital dashboard, based monitoring, and bank MFI partnership can be further utilized to reach the smaller borrowers. As you know, Bangladesh is the social laboratory for microfinance, and 700 plus microfinance institutions are in the field. And if we can have a stimulus, we have a small stimulus package for them, but I think this can be further increased. And if we can monitor well, and we can really take the money to the villages. One good thing that is happening in Bangladesh, there is a lot of remittance money coming from abroad, and this is really increasing almost every day. This year, we are expecting $20 billion plus of remittance money coming to Bangladesh, and this money will be going to the rural areas, and this money really will create a lot of liquidity in the rural areas, and the consumption will go up. and also the investment and the rural Bangladesh has changed actually. You have more small entrepreneurs, more of the nurseries, more of the poultry farms, more of the ponds, fish ponds in the rural areas, and the employment has increased in the rural areas. The wages are coming up even in these difficult periods. But as you said, urban poverty is a big problem here in Bangladesh. Informal sectors have been badly affected, but Bangladesh government has been very, I would say, prudent by not going for a very strong lockdowns. So it has given a mild lockdown. The garments factories have been kept open. Even the salaries of the garments girls have been given by the government at a very low rate of interest through the central bank and mobile financial services. So these are some of the positive things that has happened in Bangladesh. And I strongly feel that if we can continue, I'll just finish in a minute, if we can continue to keep the money market liquid and the low interest rate through refinance that has been created by the government and the central bank, and if we continue to refinance the SMEs, the small and medium enterprise, and if we keep the central bank in a outlook, developmental outlook steady, and if we can make digital financial services our new normal, and continue to prioritize agriculture and green recovery, Bangladesh probably will be again a new example of recovery even in COVID-led financial crisis. Just look at the Nikkei Asia's report today, and Bangladesh is destined to become a success story even in this disaster management as well. I think I'll stop it here. Thank you very much.
Professor Rahman, just to thank you, that was excellent. Now we'll have a few seconds where we have the technical handover in terms of sharing hosts, and we'll just go over to our next contributor, Dr. Ana Fernandez de Aranguiz from Antwerp University, who will discuss socio-economic policy in Europe from a legal political perspective. So I hope, yep, there we are. Okay, I'll leave it to you. Thank you.
Okay, first of all, can you all hear me correctly? Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for the previous speaker. It was incredibly interesting and insightful, especially for a lawyer like myself to hear very different perspectives. In particular, thank you to the chair and to Annelieke for putting together this very interesting panel. Well, today I want to talk to you a little bit about social policy in the EU, and I will focus on the proactive role of EU, not so much on the perhaps negative interference that EU has had in the past, particularly in time of the previous crisis. But instead I want to center on the active role that it has taken into developing its social dimension. To this end, I first want to explain to you a little bit what the state of play in the EU is. Some of these issues have already been discussed by the previous speaker, especially by the first speaker. I then want to talk a little bit about the social policy instruments that were in place during the previous crisis, and some of them are still. And then talk a bit more broadly about social Europe from a normative perspective. In this regard, I want to talk to you about the foundations and the to develop its social dimension. I then will continue discussing some new initiative, that is the European Pillar of Social Rights, and whether this changes the current rhetoric, and I will finalize with some general conclusions. Okay, so as some of you may know, even though Europe is considered one of the more progressive societies in the world, according to the most recent data, 22.4% of the population live in households at risk of poverty or social exclusion. In terms of inequality, 20% of the top earners received 5.1 times as much money in 2018 as the 20% with the lowest disposable income. Those in unemployment are more likely to be in a situation at risk of poverty and social exclusion. But unfortunately, increasingly, we have a
problem with in-work poverty, meaning that while employment might be key to have a better life, it's not always, not all kinds of works provide the necessary resources to live a life out of poverty. Overall, nearly 1 out of 4 people in the EU experience either income poverty, severe material deprivation, or live in a household with a very low work intensity. And as you can see from this chart, some of them combine some of these indicators of poverty. The previous speaker has already talked about how income poverty and social exclusion is not equally divided across our societies. And in the case of the EU, this is true. This is true in the case of particularly vulnerable groups, such as children, young people, women, or people with disabilities, but it is also true that there are inequalities across member states, as you can see from this chart. There's research that shows that the previous recession pushed inequalities even further in the EU. This is both within the member states and particularly hitting these vulnerable groups, and also between the different member states, creating particularly a great difference between southern and eastern countries and western countries in the EU. In the current context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the European institutions expected this will also affect incredibly income. They particularly expect there's going to be a 9% increase in unemployment. And while there is supposed to be a partial recovery during the 2021, they still expect rising poverty and inequalities, particularly among vulnerable groups with low skills or certain sectors of the economy, such as tourism, that are heavily affected. So considering the situation in Europe, it is very clear that poverty and social exclusion or inequalities are quite a challenge in the EU. And in my next slides, I want to talk to you about how the EU has been addressing this challenge. In the first place, I want to talk to you about the social policy instruments that have been in place. And these were already in place during the previous crisis to a greater or lesser extent. The oldest of these instruments is the social open method of coordination. It's almost 20 years since this mechanism was put in place. And it's basically a voluntary system where EU institutions and member states report how they are doing in terms of social protection, healthcare, and pensions. It is voluntary and a soft instrument, but it has served to develop indicators and to boost conversations between member states, sometimes learning from better experiences, and other times in terms of name and shaming. On the other hand, we have the Europe 2020 strategy, which was the strategy of the EU for the years 2010-2020, that tackled diverse challenges for the EU. One of these challenges that was framed in the form of a headline target was poverty and social exclusion. And particularly, the EU and member states aimed at lifting 20 million people out of poverty. This objective was accompanied by a set of rules or a set of guidelines and the European Platform Against Poverty. And this is to be supported by a number of funds, perhaps most notably the European Social Fund or the Fund of European Aid for the Most Deprived. Most of these policy instruments are monitored through the European semester. The European semester was originally conceived as an economic and market monitoring system, but increasingly, especially since the adoption of the Europe 2020 strategy, it has also taken on board social issues. As such, it's a very interesting tool because it combines a number of different policy areas of the EU under the same umbrella monitoring system. It works in a cyclical manner. So in autumn, the Commission launches the annual growth survey, where the Commission identifies different priorities or obstacles for the European Union. These are later to be addressed at the national level by member states. And in the winter, they present their national reform programs, identifying particular country-specific issues or bottlenecks in order to incorporate these European-wide priorities. Then in the spring, the Commission analyzes these national reform programs and provides country-specific recommendations. and member states are deemed to implement this until the cycle restarts again in the autumn. This is normally how the European semester works, but because of the COVID-19 crisis, 2021 and possibly 2022 will be slightly different, with a particular focus on recovery and resilience plans of the Commission. So these are the policy instruments, but in parallel, we also have a normative social core at the EU that has been developed over the years. In the first place, I want to talk a little bit about the foundations, and we see these social foundations of the EU in the first place in the values of the EU, which we see in the Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union, where we emphasize the respect for human dignity, for human rights, solidarity and equality. And we also see it in the general principles of the European Union. In Article 3, where the Union says that it aims at becoming a social market economy that combats social exclusion, promotes social justice and protection, aims at social and territorial cohesion and solidarity. Now, these two provisions are particularly important when the Union aims at exercising its competences, and I will get back into this in a minute, but they are important because the Union has functional competences. This means the following. The Union can only act insofar as it is to implement one of these objectives and according to the values. As such, when the Union exercises competences that are enshrined under different provisions, it needs to be, these initiatives need to target one of the objectives that I just mentioned. The values and the objectives of the European Union are supposed to be mainstreamed through different policy areas. And this is enshrined in Article 9 of the Treaty on the Function of the European Union, which is the so-called horizontal social clause. And on top of this, of course, we have the Charter on Fundamental Rights that covers a number of important areas with a social dimension, not the least human dignity, an entire chapter on equality, and perhaps most remarkably, an entire chapter on solidarity that includes rights on fair remuneration, social protection and social security, healthcare, etc. Now, considering these foundations, there are a number of competences that the Union has to act, to take initiatives. When we talk about social initiatives for social protection and directly targeting inequality, we mostly talk about the social competences of the Union in Article 153. This is the social title of the European Union, and therefore the stricto sensu competences of the Union. This title covers a number of different fields that go from working conditions, social security and social protection for workers, integration of people excluded from the labor market, the combating of social exclusion, etc. Now, not all these fields allow for the adoption of binding instruments. Some of them are limited to cooperation, and how these instruments need to be adopted depend on its field. Some of them required unanimity, and some of them required only qualified majority voting. So they are very diverse. Now, even though there are a bunch of fields, and I think there's even 7 or 8 fields where the Union may act from the stricto competences, there are also a bunch of limitations. One, it's an obvious one that any initiative should not affect excessively small and medium enterprises, but it's also a certain limitations towards the protection of social protection systems of member states, including that the European Union cannot regulate anything that is a matter of fundamental principle of social security or that affects disproportionately the financial equilibrium of member states. There is also a non-regression clause, and on top of that, there are a number of areas that are specifically excluded from the competences. For example, the right to collective action or regulating pay or remuneration. With these social competences, we see that there is a lot of legislation on fair working conditions and health and safety, but unfortunately, a number of other important fields, particularly for those who do not work and suffer from inequalities, have been untapped. Besides the competences, the stricto sensu, there are also a number of other competences that, while not being social per se, they have developed also an important social dimension. In this line of thought, we talk about equality with a lot of regulations on equal opportunities and treatment. We talk about citizenship. We talk about free movement of workers and social security coordination. We talk about a number of employment competences. And these are also complemented by a number of competences to develop funds, the European Social Fund that has a particular legal base, and the competences to aim for economic and territorial and social cohesion. Now, what I've been talking about, the social policy part, the instruments, and these competences were there in place before the Great Recession, and still we experience an increase in inequalities and an increase in poverty and social exclusion. My question here is whether we are doomed or not to follow the same path within the new economic crisis. If we did not use these tools more effectively in the previous one, what changes things for 2020, 2021? In this sense, in 2017, an interesting event took place, and was the adoption of the European Pillar of Social Rights, which was launched by the Commission and then interinstitutionally proclaimed by the EU institutions and the member states. What this instrument is, in essence, is a set of 20 principles. They are divided in 3 chapters on social issues, namely equality, fair working conditions, and social protection. Whether the European Pillar of Social Rights is a game changer or not is a discussion. On the positive note, there are a number of key elements of this new instrument that could perhaps tackle some of the deficiencies of the previous system. Among this, I want to highlight 3. The pillar is far more concrete than other instruments that we have. It identifies very specific rights from some that are more traditionally more general. To give you an example, this could be the case of the right to minimum income, from a more general right to social protection or social assistance, or the right to a fair minimum wage, from a more general right to the right to fair working conditions. Secondly, the pillar has a very important connecting function. In the documents that accompany the pillar, there are important links made not only within EU law, primary law and secondary legislation, soft law instruments as well, but also with international instruments on social rights. And as such, it can be key to identify different problematic areas or different issues that we have to look into on the social arena. And thirdly, the European Pillar of Social Rights is supposed to act as a compass. In this regard, it's interesting to mention that this pillar is accompanied by the social scoreboard, which is a set of indicators that allow to monitor and supervise how member states are doing vis-a-vis other years or other member states in a number of specific targeted areas on social issues. Now, this is for the positive, of course. On the negative side, the pillar is for now a soft law instrument, and it lacks a clear roadmap, which puts into question whether this will be used in the following years, when the following commission perhaps doesn't have the same social interest as the one, or perhaps the economic effects of the corona crisis are being felt more and more. Also, on the positive point here is that in 2021, we expect to have an action plan on the pillar, which perhaps will address some of these limitations. So far, the European Pillar of Social Rights has served to activate the social core and tap some of these provisions that I was talking about earlier. In terms of legal initiatives, this has led to the adoption of a recommendation on access to social protection for workers and the self-employed, to adopt a directive on work-life balance, a directive on transparent and predictable working conditions. There is currently a proposal by the Commission to adopt directive on minimum wages that needs to be discussed before the Parliament and the Council. And there are plans to incorporate, perhaps in the future, a European unemployment benefit scheme in the form of a reinsurance system, an instrument for the protection of platform workers, and still quite more far in the future, an instrument on minimum income. To end my presentation, I would like to end my conclusions in the form of a plus negative sort of view. what I said in the beginning is something that I want to bring back to the conclusions. 10 years ago, the EU and member states committed to lift 20 million people out of poverty. 10 years after, they only managed to lift 3 million people. Yes, of course, there was a financial crisis, but the fact that they did not live up to those objectives, even though they were already aware of an economic crisis happening, leads us to think that the Union shall do more. My previous research shows, and a little bit what I've explained in this presentation, is that this failure or these underwhelming results are not necessarily a result of the EU being unequipped, but more that more result of not activating the tools that we already have. In this regard, it is a very positive thing that the European Pillar of Social Rights has activated and has led to this increasing activation of the social competences and leads to the expansion of the social dimension of the EU. Now, in this here, I want to make a link with what the first speaker has said. Is that this is one aspect of EU law. This is how the EU can take a more proactive role. What we cannot forget is that there remain enormous constitutional asymmetries that favor economic and market interest. And as such, activating the social competences is not enough to become a social market union. For that, a structural reform would be necessary that targets, as the first speaker said, more fiscal and banking reforms and mixes the different strands of the EU law in a more comprehensive way. So here I end my presentation. Thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you. I'll just ask Annelieke to prepare her slides, and then we'll have the final contributor to today's session, our colleague in the school, Annelieke Mooij, who's looking at the European System of Central Banks legal framework on social policy. So Annelieke, can I hand over to you, and then we'll go into the plenary session.
Thank you. So yes, today I'll be talking about the European System of Central Banks, but also about central banks in general. Unlike our second speaker, I'll be talking a little bit more about the legal framework. So what kind of legal issues are we facing when we talk about social policy and central banks? Now, most modern central banks were founded in the late 20th century, and they were based upon this idea of central bank independence. Now, this idea comes from economics, and it basically boils down that independent central banks can control for inflation better. So that's the large idea. And the idea behind that is that if you have politicians in charge of your printing press, then they're going to promise free stuff. They're going to promise free education or healthcare just so that they can get re-elected. And in order to do that, they will print money and therefore will have hyperinflation. And hyperinflation is bad for everyone. So therefore, we have independent central banks. But this is not one framework. There are even more type of central banks within this central bank independence idea. So we have banks with dual mandates or single mandates. Single mandate just focuses at price stability, whilst dual mandate will also look at other options or other targets. And we have different levels of independence. So to give you a concrete example, if we look at New Zealand and the New Zealand Federal Reserve Bank, that mandate of price stability, what inflation target to reach, the governor of the central bank agrees upon that with the Minister of Finance. So there you have a dialogue between the central bank and the minister. And therefore, we say that that bank is very low in its independence. Also, if we look a little bit further to the United States, we see that there is a dual mandate. So the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States will actually target both price inflation, price stability, and full employment. So they have two main mandates. This is that dual mandate. And their independence is vested in normal law. So it only takes an act of Congress to change the central bank. So therefore we say that's independent, but less so than, for example, the South African Central Bank, which has a single mandate, but in context. So the South African Central Bank has to focus at price stability because it's good for the economy. And this independence is vested in the Constitution. That means it's a lot more independent from the government. And we even recently saw this come into play, and there was a crisis and there was a debate between the central bank and President Zuma. And this went in front of the Constitutional Court, and the central bank was actually granted their independence again. This was reaffirmed by the court. And therefore the president lost. So we see that the central bank, when the independence is vested in the constitution, it's a lot more independent. Now, when we come to the ESCB, or the European System of Central Banks, which is the European Central Bank, or the ECB, together with all the national central banks of the Eurozone, and they're highly independent. So the treaty states that they're not allowed to seek instructions or seek to instruct. So member states or member state bodies cannot instruct the ECB. Now that's very independent. And this independence is even more so than, for example, a constitutional independence, because it's vested in a treaty. Now it's vested in the treaty of the functioning of the European Union. And in order to change that treaty, all member states must agree. And the moment that you start to change that treaty, the debate opens on every aspect of the treaty. So it's very, very difficult to change that. And that's why arguably this European Central Bank is the most independent on the planet. Now this independence was vested in the idea of a very narrow mandate. So from a democratic perspective, yes, they were independent, but they had this really narrow mandate, which was based on the monetarism idea of monetary policy, which strictly separates monetary policy in one corner and economic policy in another. With the idea that monetary policy is just money times the speed that it moves around, which is equal to price times aggregate output. So this was a very narrow concept. And the idea was, well, monetary policy is just a matter of advanced math. So there's no political choice there, so we don't really need to hold them accountable that much. But even here, we already see these authorization gaps. So price stability itself can be defined by the European Central Bank. It's not defined in the treaty. There are some limitations which even further increase the independence, such as it cannot directly lend to governments. There are hearings before the parliament, so there is some form of accountability, but there are no consequences to this. So when we look at expectations and problem, it was already considered, oh, this bank is probably too conservative. It cannot actually do anything against the crisis because it has such a narrow mandate. And others said, well, this accountability will be an issue. So when we look at the Euro crisis and now the COVID crisis, well, with the Euro crisis, the ECB was forced to act. There was no political will to come to a solution because it would be difficult for the politicians to sell it at home, and they couldn't actually reach an agreement. And these policies, and I'd like to refer a little bit to Georgopolous, the first speaker. He already mentioned that there were these very strong austerity policies. Now, these were debated by economists, so some argued in favor, others argued against them. And the moment that these policies are economically debated, so austerity was partially enforced. It was negotiated between what we call the Troika and the countries. And the Troika consisted of the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission. And they really negotiated on economic policy, on what fiscal discipline a country should run. And the moment that we see this ECB acting on this economic terrain, where it can be debated, where there are serious economists giving serious economic debate, that's the moment the legal fiction was shattered. So under the law, we thought, well, this is just advanced economics, it's advanced math, it's advanced macroeconomics, but it's not, doesn't include political choices. And we slowly start to see that actually political choices are dripping in. So today we know that central bank policy does actually include choices. And central bank independence has also developed and matured. So it focused less now at independence, and economists have a tendency to focus more on checks and balances. And we also saw that actually the lesser independent banks did a lot better than the ECB during the Euro crisis. So coming to social policy, the difficulty here is that a central bank usually has a limited mandate and very limited accountability. Now, in a democracy, when choices have to be made, we like to know that there is some form of democratic accountability, which comes through the legislator, through the government. But that's very difficult with very independent central banks. So the question becomes, well, should a central bank make these choices? Remember, a central bank is not the government of economic affairs. It's not the council that we elect to take care of our national economic interests or social choices. Now, this doesn't mean that we cannot actually include social policy, because there are some social policies that are arguably so important and so agreed upon that they should be part of every single institution in the European Union or in national countries. Now, with the ECB, we've seen that they actually slowly accepted climate change as part of this social policy. Now, that doesn't mean that the ECB is actually going to go out and plant trees, but they promote what they call green bonds. Now, green bonds are investments into green products. All sounds lovely. And we can all agree that climate change is very important and it's better to invest in green. But what is green? So to give you a practical example, I've shared on my screen two pictures. On the left bottom corner, what you see is a plane recently flown in a model size by TU Delft, a University of Technology. And if this plane works, it can actually carry passengers and freight at roughly half of the fuel that current planes need. Now, is this green? On the one hand, yes, it's probably more fuel efficient, so that might be green, because we can transport people and goods at less out emissions. But on the other hand, at the top right-hand corner, we see a hyperloop, which has a tendency or a potential to actually carry freight and passengers with zero emissions. So is that equally green? Or is the one green and the other isn't green? Which one is more green? Now, these are choices to be made when you have a system of green bonds. And the question that I want to ask, is the central bank the right body or the right organ to make such decisions? As an advantage, central banks are a lot more efficient. So their decision-making can be a lot quicker than governments. And they're also capable of taking politically unwanted decisions. So because a central bank doesn't need to be elected, they can take decisions that others potentially won't. And we saw this during the Euro crisis. When there was a political lack of political will, when there was a standstill, the European Central Bank managed to step in. But on the other hand, the fact that they're not elected also means that they're not very democratic. So do we want a central bank to make these choices about what is green, what type of social policies we should focus on? And a lot of these decisions made by a central bank are very difficult to undo. And we shouldn't aim to be able to undo them that quickly either. Because if we look at Mario Draghi in 2012, the Euro crisis was at its height, and Mario Draghi said, listen, whatever it takes, we will do to keep the Eurozone together. And that single statement actually stabilized markets. So because he can actually follow through, because markets know that a central bank can follow through, these decisions have a lot of effect. So therefore, we shouldn't be aiming to undo them that quickly, because they would lose this massive effect. So the questions that I want to leave you with is, first of all, what social goals do we want a central bank to be promoting? Is there a hierarchy of social goals? And what happens if they're conflicting? So for example, Professor Rahman mentioned that a lot of inequality in Bangladesh was counteracted by focusing on the clothing industry and on agricultural and small and medium enterprises in agriculture. Now, these are not the best industries when it comes to climate change. So here we see a small conflict starting. Now, what should a central bank do? And when they make these choices, is it up to a central bank who's not democratic? Or should we make central banks more democratic? Or should we leave it to the government who is democratically elected? So these are the questions that I have for you as an audience. And with that, I look forward to the discussion, and I'm very happy with such great panelists, and I hope we can get a discussion going.
That's great. Annelieke, that was brilliant. Thank you. Colleagues, just a reminder that we have a hard guillotine at 2:30. So we have a little bit of a constraint on our time. So can I ask people if they want to send me or use the chat function to send me the question, and we'll then call on the questioner to address the panel. So do we have any questions in the mix?
Well, if I may ask then, I would like to
Annelieke?
ask Professor Rahman. So you mentioned in your presentation quite a lot of social policy that the central bank conducted. And I was wondering, what is your relationship with, what is the relationship between the central bank and the government? How are these choices made?
You are right. Central bank. It unlike many of the developed countries' central bank, the central bank in Bangladesh, although legally independent in the not in the constitution but in the act. But it's very difficult to sustain that independence because it's not in the constitution. You can be fired any moment. So the governor is not that I would say protected. But at the same time, because of the, as you said about the European Central Bank, it's very competent, very the credibility is very high. So if you have a courageous governor, you can take many social policies on your own. And as a central bank governor, I took many of the policies on my own, including the one you would mention about the green finance. We now have a sustainable finance department in the central bank, which has got a lot of refinance facilities, green transformation fund for the RMG sectors and all that. We created the new ideas, and there was not much hitch from the government, but the relationship between the governor and the Ministry of Finance was not at all so sweet during those days. Many a times we hit headlines. The finance minister was talking something and I was opposing. So that happened, but I sustained. But at some point in time, the relationship really soured. So it's not very easy. But at the moment, I would say the central bank has really lost that kind of courage, and looks like they are quite aligned with the government. That's my diplomatic answer.
Excellent, thank you. Let's see, any other questions coming in there from the floor? Okay. Well, I may put one into the mix if that's okay. Just in terms of a little bit of prognostication, how you see the next 5 years playing out in this area. It's very interesting to sort of, to backcast, as it were, and have a sense of what's gone wrong and, what's being addressed. But given the sort of the era we're currently living through, nearly unprecedented in a century, it's just interesting to get the panel's view on what you think could happen in the next number of years. And maybe one for all the panel. So
yes, I guess I could first make a comment. I think you're going to have a lot of discussion around the role of the central bank, like Annelieke spoke about, discussion about the independence of a central bank versus their role in providing greater assistance towards social programs. We see expanded role of the central bank. We first saw it during the financial crisis in Europe and in the US, and more so now with COVID. So for example, in Canada here, the Bank of Canada, our central bank, for the first time purchased provincial bonds to assist the provinces. So there was then a debate talking about, well, this is the central bank now helping out with fiscal policy, but also regional fiscal policy, across provinces. So this gets very political. I mean, how many bonds should the central bank buy of province of Ontario versus British Columbia versus Newfoundland, and at what price? So I think this is going to be a very important issue over the next 5 years. So that the central banks are providing a lot of liquidity and a lot of liquidity to governments, meaning large deficits, big debt. So their role will be further discussed and debated, I think, over the next 5 years. And also in Canada, another debate with the central bank is, should they actually be targeting inflation? As Annelieke said, that is their, for many banks, primary goal. Stability, generally stability of the price level, but allowing a bit of inflation, 2%. Again, what is the role of the central bank? Should they abandon that? So I think that'll be the big debate over the next 5 years.
Thank you. Professor Rahman, did you want to come in?
Yes, I think it's very difficult to say what is unfolding in the next 5 years or in 5 months. It all depends at the moment on how do we really, address the pandemic, the virus. How do we really, suppress this, and the business condition, particularly the business expectation, will depend a lot on how we handle it. So that's number one. Number two, I think in the next 5 years or so, the central banks of different types, the developing countries' central bank probably will look more developmental than the developed countries. They probably will be targeting on one or two of the mandates, as Anne has mentioned about it. But in developing countries like ours, probably we will be targeting multiple objectives and targets, and the central bank will be aligned with the government probably for many years to come, because here has already given up too much of its independence in many of the developing countries, and they are really substituting the revenue earnings of the government, and probably putting in a lot of liquidity into the market and helping not only the government but also the corporations and others. And really, it's time to see how they will unwrap it, and what could be the impact on inflation because of the so much of leverages in the market. But the time is so sensitive at the moment and critical, we may not even discuss about it. Bangladesh particularly, we managed our inflation quite well, kept it within a limit, and our budget deficit remained at 5%, and we didn't put up a lot of quantitative easing even during the post global financial crisis. But now it's all open, so I'm really don't know what will unfold in the coming days. There is a risk coming up in the inflation front, and as well in the net non-performing asset, which is increasing. So I thought the central bank has to really have the guts to tell it frankly that, and maybe have to negotiate with the government that it has to maintain both stability and inflation, but even then go for social policies which they had been going. So it will be very, very difficult task which will be unfolding in the coming days.
Professor Rahman, thank you. Dr. Aranguiz, did you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you very much. I will join Professor Rahman saying that it is very difficult to say at this point with how things are going to unfold in 5 years' time. From the point of view of social policy at the EU and more from a legal and policy perspective, I have to say I am quite positive. I think there's a lot of lessons that have been learned from the previous crisis, and things are being done slightly different. I think the new Resilience and Recovery Facility has formulated its goals in a very hybrid form, and it puts together social interest as well as economic and market one, and that makes it very interesting. It also combines loans and direct funding, which I think it will ease the burden on member states. Much of this will ultimately depend on how member states use these resources, of course. But I think at least at the EU level is a good first step. It's also a good sign that initiatives that were not even on the plans before are now on the plans, particularly targeting vulnerable groups that are expected to be particular victims of this crisis, and that the Commission is continuing with the other initiatives that were already on the board before of the Corona crisis. And if I may use this opportunity to ask one question to Annelieke, so I'm more efficient. You said the central banks are more efficient because they don't have a political will. And beyond setting social goals and the questions that you raised that I think are very interesting, I was wondering if this is an exercise of simple math, and this coming from a legal and political expert, but definitely not economic one. How can the simple math exercise take into account the negative effects of economic decisions or monetary decisions in the social sphere?
So thank you very much for that question. So I'll first say what I hope that will happen in 5 years. So I think that central banks should become a little bit more social active and take into consideration with their policies certain social goals. But I do think when we look at the European Central Bank in particularly, that it's too independent currently to do so. So I hope for more cooperation when it comes to determining what is social policy, which social policy is more important, what to do when conflicting. So a central bank's main task is, of course, keeping prices stable, so to prevent hyperinflation and prevent a deflation gap. So that is what should be the main goal of a central bank. But it can do that whilst also taking into consideration some social goals. And I hope that we can see some sort of framework being developed by the legislator, and that it becomes a little bit more efficient for central banks to implement a democratic legally framework that's generated, implement that in their daily activities. Now, when it comes to your question, can these math issues, can that take into effect the negative consequences? Well, this is where kind of like, so when the Treaty of Maastricht was drafted, so in 1992, this was considered, the central bank was founded on monetarism, and monetarism came among others, but Milton Friedman was a very pragmatic supporter of that, who said price stability itself, so preventing hyperinflation, is just economics, and it's calculating how much money is there times how quickly does it go around, the velocity, and that equals the prices times the aggregate output. And that was considered very much math, or economics, actually, monetary economics, and calculating that. But we've seen that that doesn't really happen. Economic policy and monetary policy are very much intertwined, which is also something that the European Court directly accepted, despite this not being in the treaties. And because it's intertwined and because they actually impact each other, we cannot expect a central bank to take into consideration negative issues when they're not supposed to. But now that we've accepted this, the question is, how can a central bank take this into consideration, and especially by what level? So how do they make decisions on which negative consequences is worse? In the case of Greece and the Euro crisis, there was a serious risk of the Eurozone falling apart. There was talk of the Grexit, and then other countries might follow. So the ECB was faced with either saving the Euro or going outside of its mandate probably, or not going outside of its mandate and remaining very conservative, but the Eurozone might fall apart. And how to make these decisions, that is very difficult, and especially for such an independent central bank.
Annelieke, thank you. Colleagues, it's just gone 2:30 and we have a hard guillotine, as they might say. So I want to thank all our contributors today. It was a really excellent seminar. To thank Annelieke and our colleagues in the Dublin Law and Politics Review for organising the event, and to Anna and Professor Rahman And George, you know, really excellent contributions, and I think the audience are incredibly appreciative. Unfortunately, we can't really show you the applause, so you'll sort of have to take our word for it that it's there. So just to thank everybody for their contributions, it was really, really excellent, and to thank the organizers. Well done, guys. Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you
Well
very
done.
much to you,
Thank you.
Dr. Derek O'Brien, for chairing this event. Thank you to our chairperson, Annelieke, who was also a speaker in a very, very enlightening presentation. And thank you to all of our speakers. I have found them incredibly interesting. All of your topics were amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.